Good morning and welcome to our second charity webinar of 2024. We appreciate you joining us. I'm Keith McPherson, Audit Partner and Head of Henderson Loggie's Charities and Not-for-Profit team, and I'll be chairing the session this morning. Just taking a few minutes also to let you get set up in advance of handing over to our speaker. Today's topic is on financial distress and trustee duties, and the purpose of this session is to consider responsibilities on charity trustees when financial environment becomes extremely difficult, something which unfortunately is happening more and more on the back of the challenges of recent years. I'm delighted to have Shona.Campbell, our partner in our business recovery and insolvency team, to take us through this session. Now I'm sure Shona will go into. The first part of our title is as important, if not more so, than the latter, as the insolvency or closing the doors is very much the last resort option. But just before I hand over to Shona, just a couple of the housekeeping matters. We've got up to about 45 minutes set aside for this morning's session, so that is my principal KPI to meet and be judged to set against. We've got some time included to take some questions at the end. I know Shona will be delighted to take your questions. So if there's anything you want to ask, then please add that into the Q&A box, which you'll find hopefully certainly at the bottom of my screen on Zoom, and you can type that in and we'll go through those questions at the end. There definitely are no stupid questions in this area. Just to confirm, we'll also be getting copies of the slides to you afterwards, so no need to be taking down detailed notes of everything that goes through as you go through. So on that note, I think without further delay, I'll hand over now to Shona to take us through her presentation. Thank you, Shona.
Okay, and thank you, Keith, for the introduction there. So financial distress and trustees' duties. Just what we're going to cover today, quick outline. So a bit of introduction and context. Financial checks, what information should you be reviewing? Warning signs of distress, red flags. Personal liability and the impact on trustees personally when there's a insolvency process, and process implications of winding up a charity. And then we'll have some discussion and questions and wrap up. So I am a licensed insolvency practitioner, and I think that that means that I act in formal insolvencies. There's the Grim Reaper, and I think that's the perception that you only speak to a liquidator when you need to put the company into liquidation, and it's the death knell and the final stage of the company. But that's not true, because I don't just act as a liquidator. I provide advice to charities on the options open to them in distress, but I also assist with informal wind-ups and solvent wind-ups, because there are many of the practical considerations that you do when you're dealing with an insolvency are also what you would do when you're just winding up a business or a charity through a solvent process. And in those ones, there can be a surplus to go to another charity. So I've been the liquidator of many charities, however, and personally, I'm also a charity trustee of two charities. So, and one of these charities had a bit of a difficult time in COVID, as did many. That charity relied on council funding, multi-year council funding, which was withdrawn completely, which was the last thing that was needed at the same time as COVID. So I've got experience of sitting around a table as a trustee with other trustees discussing, do we need additional financial controls, liaising with Oscar, submitting notifiable events, dealing with accounts that have a going concern issue, and actually discussing whether or not we should be winding up that charity. So I've sort of been in that seat as well as advised on it. So I'm also a chartered accountant, and I think the two charities that I am a trustee of, I'm treasurer in both of those. Understanding and preparing financial statements and financial information, working with spreadsheets, with cool Excel formulas, it's second nature to me. And I work with the signs of distress and the tools to deal with every day. But the fact is that many charities don't have a trustee who can sort out a circular reference in a spreadsheet, and that probably isn't the biggest issue. But the point is that charity boards don't always have somebody with financial expertise, and it's even less common to have one where you've got somebody who's used to dealing with distress. And this can be even more difficult when a board is relying on perhaps poor financial information and, as trustees, slightly removed from the day-to-day operations of actually what's going on in the charity. When things go wrong, it can be a stressful time for trustees, and there may be personal consequences. So the aim of today is to provide some tools for trustees to help navigate financial distress. That's what it says on the tin. What to look for, some clever questions to ask around that table, and what happens when it does all go wrong. And I hope that there are a few learning points from today. But a key one is take advice early. Reputable insolvency practitioners will give initial advice without charging for it. And that might be enough just to give the trustees a peace of mind around what the current position is and the planned course of action. You don't speak to a liquidator just when you think you need to appoint one. Speaking to one early enough may mean that you never need to appoint a liquidator in a formal capacity. So that's the Grim Reaper there, but it's the helping hand on the right, independent advice to give you a hand when things are getting tough. So now I think Keith touched on the financial backdrop here, and I could probably spend 40 minutes on, what are the challenges facing charities in Scotland at the moment. But I think that the point here is that, all charities are facing most of these at the moment. So, there is a lot of distress and there's a lot of challenge out there. So decreased funding and donations with economic uncertainty and the ongoing cost of living crisis, it means that there's just disposable income for many individuals, fewer donations to charities, coupled with an increase in the demand for charitable services. We've got a reduction in government funding, cuts to the public sector funding, both from the UK, Scottish Government, local council, significantly impacted on the availability of the grants and other financial support that many charities do rely on. Increased demand for services. Again, the cost of living crisis, more people are turning to charities for support due to rising costs, particularly in areas like food, energy, housing, and this just puts additional financial strain on charities, many of which are struggling to meet their needs. I know that with the charity that I'm a trustee of, never had as many referrals as they've been getting through in the last couple of years. Rising operational costs, inflation, rising costs of goods and services leading to increased operational expenses, rent, utility, wages. Those charities, particularly with large physical premises or large staff numbers, are finding it increasingly difficult to cover costs. Energy costs, just again, that's particularly those with large physical premises, more expensive to maintain operations. Then we've got challenges with fundraising events. So the cost of organising fundraising events has increased, and then the participation rates have also dropped out due to the financial constraints on supporters. Traditional fundraising methods are less viable. There's also, with outdoor events and weather, public health concerns, it's made it more challenging to plan and execute successful fundraising events. Sustainability, long-term planning. Many charities have limited financial reserves, restricting their ability to plan long-term, whether unexpected financial difficulties. And then there's also been some strategic funding cuts in terms of there's more funders are there's less multi-year funding available. It's more difficult to secure it, and it's more difficult to plan for the future and invest in long-term projects. Digital and technological developments, that is, there is developments there, but to actually, particularly for smaller charities, to stay on top of it, to get the upgrades, to understand what the need is and how to implement it, the costs and the time can be prohibitive. Cybersecurity threats as well, and then staffing and volunteer issues, wage pressure. There is under pressure to increase wages. often lack the funds to do so, which means difficulties in retaining staff, and then volunteering shortages. There's been a decline in volunteer numbers due to financial pressures on individuals, and that just again increases operational costs as charities need to hire paid staff to do what previously they would have volunteers doing. So I think it's quite clear that there's a difficult financial environment that the Scottish charities are operating in the moment, and in terms of just balancing the immediate operational needs with the pressures of securing sustainable long-term funding, it is difficult. Okay, so what information to review? But before that, I'm going to just speak about what is insolvency. And insolvency is two definitions. Is one, when your assets, your liabilities are greater than your assets, and the other one is when you can't pay debts as and when they fall due. Now, there might be a lot of charities whose have their liabilities that are greater than assets, but as long as they're able to pay debts as and when they fall due, they'll be able to avoid insolvency. And formal insolvency is, we're speaking about, depending on the legal entity that your charity is, and we'll touch on that in a moment. A formal insolvency process is, is it liquidation? Is it bankruptcy? But and then in terms of that, the formal insolvency process is kicked off. It's either the trustees make the decision to enter insolvency, or a creditor will. And as charity trustees, you don't ever want to be in the position where a creditor is the one that's doing it. You want to be on top of everything so that if insolvency needs to happen, it's the trustees that are in control and they are driving the process. And it's not a creditor that forces a sort of catastrophic insolvency event, which have just a massive impact on your employees and your service users. So key learning point number 2 for today is reliable financial information is key. The financial reports provided to trustees need to provide enough information to assess the financial position of the charity. Exactly what is required will depend on the charity, what it does, and the size. Whatever the reports are, they need to be prepared and they need to be fully considered by the trustees. And then a point with this is that there's a few different things on that list, and I sort of just work through them individually. But this is sort of like all charities should have some, if not most of this. So you need regular financial reporting. You need a balance sheet. And then you need analysis of your income and expenditure statement. Is it being prepared regularly? Is it timely? So you want something that's prepared pretty soon after a month end or a quarter end. You don't want to be waiting months and months for it. Do the previous figures tie into the previous reports? You want to see some sort of analysis against the budget. What were we supposed to do? Maybe what did happen last year with variances? And the variances are okay. You need to be able to explain them, and the explanations need to be able to make sense. Cash flow forecast as well. You should be preparing this on a monthly basis, a year and ahead, when you're doing the annual budget. And if cash can be tight, then you should be looking at it on a weekly cash flow, a minimum of 13 weeks that you roll forward and prepare. Regular review of reserves. What is your reserves policy? Is the policy right? And is the charity in line with the policy? So most charities will use a month's amount of operating costs, maybe 3 months, 6 months of operating costs. So the other thing to remember here is, what are the operating costs? When were the operating costs last updated? Particularly with things like wage increases and other increases in inflation, the sort of your previous reserves figure might actually need to be increased if your monthly operating costs have increased. Internal audits is something to think about, particularly for the larger charities. Trustees are usually removed from the day-to-day operations, so engaging an external provider to review certain procedures, it can provide comfort that everything is being done properly, and also make suggestions on how it can be done even better. Risk management, is there a risk register? What are the risks? Diversity of income is the next point, but that's a key risk. If you're over reliant on one particular funder, what would happen, or how likely is it that funder is unable to fund, or it is withdrawn suddenly? can the charity diversify? What are the sources of that? Is it a key member of staff? Again, in some smaller charities, you might have somebody in a chief executive position that really is doing everything. And if they were knocked over by a bus or get another job, then it would be a bit of a disaster. So what are the risks and what can you do to mitigate those risks? Monitoring fundraising performance. I mean, classic ones like here's the schedule of everything that we've applied for. These are the ones that were successful. These were the ones that were not. Why were they not successful? Is there any common themes coming through that we can address? And then also, which ones have we still have applications that have not been yet awarded? And then what are the ones that we're going to go for in the future? With pound values there, just as what is our future funding stream likely to look like? Monitoring of restricted reserves. So this is where a grant may be provided for a very specific source, a specific application, and it's important to make sure that the money that has been used is being used, the given for a specific use is being used for that purpose, and not to meet other costs of the running of the charity. Monitoring of some subsidiary companies. Now, they will have separate directors and trustees, and they will be separate legal entities, but it's quite important just to stay on top of the financial performance of that subsidiary entity. And will there be any impact if that company were to fail on the parent company? And the classic one here is that where you have, if a charity has been funding a trading company, so giving it money, and the trading company is using that money up because it's operating at a loss, the charity company will have a debtor, money due back in that balance sheet, which will show as an asset in the balance sheet of the charity. However, although there's an asset value there, in reality, if the subsidiary company doesn't have any assets and isn't making any money, will that balance ever be repaid? So that's just one of the instances where it's important to have an overview of what is actually going on in the subsidiary company. And then the final point, just to remember, is that you might have a treasurer, you might have a finance committee, but all trustees are responsible. And that's the man there pointing. It was a fringe show a couple of years ago. It wasn't me, it was him. But just remember that just because your title's not treasurer doesn't mean that you're absolved of any responsibility in dealing with finances. So that's sort of the information that you should be reviewing on a regular basis. And then here's the red flags. Red flag number one. So this is, I said, I've been involved in the insolvency of quite a few charities over the years, and just when I go back and think about, what were the red flags that somebody might have seen beforehand that there might have been a bit of a problem here, that maybe the trustees could have picked up on things a bit earlier. And the first one is lack of reliable financial information. If you can't tell what the liability or the asset position of a charity is, it's likely to be a bit of a mess. So, if you are getting your management accounts months and months in arrears, if there are no cash flow forecasts, you need to get that sorted out. Creditor arrears. So again, just that increase, and it's looking back at what was the month last year, what are all the balances. I mean, many charities, a well-run charity probably will not have any arrears other than just the last month of trading. And then with them, and everything just gets paid on time as and when. So as soon as that starts to slip, it's a suggestion that things are not well. HMRC in particular is one to pay attention to in terms of, is the PAYE an NIC that's been deducted up to date? Most creditors, you need to pay them to get them to, so you need to pay your employees every month. If you need to pay your utility bill to get your, and if you've got any sort of your day-to-day operational trading costs, you need to pay your creditors or they will stop supplying you. HMRC, you cannot pay your PAYE, and HMRC doesn't do anything immediately. So arrears can build up without any immediate consequences. So quite often, if you've got a charity that is in financial distress, it will be HMRC balance that's increasing, and that's one of the first signs that you'll see. And that will happen way before the next point there, which is the creditors taking legal action. And that's where creditors have been saying, will you pay us, please? Will you pay us, please? You're not paid us. Do you know what we're going to do? We're going to get a stat demand, we're going to apply to court, and then we're going to get a liquidator appointed. So if you've got letters from creditors threatening legal action, definite sign that things are not well. The loss-making trading subsidiary, that is something that I've just spoke about in the last slide there. The other thing, which is not uncommon in some of the companies that have been pointed over, is a unreconciled bank account. So this comes back to just the lack of financial information. OSCR guidance is that trustees should be reviewing bank reconciliations and they should be reviewing bank statements. So you should be doing this. And what is an unreconciled bank account? So that's when you get the management accounts through, and the management accounts say that there's £250,000 in the bank account. So all the trustees are like, great, we've got £250,000 in the bank account. We're only spending £14,000 a month. Great, everything's hunky dory. And then if you were to look at the bank statement all of a sudden is not £250,000 in the bank. The bank statement's got £1.50 in it. And that's maybe a bit of an extreme action, but that's if people aren't keeping the books and records up to date with what's going on in the bank statement, and the bank statement doesn't have any cash in it, then you've got a problem. Another red flag, and I'm not sure, which one's which, and sometimes it's a bit of both or either. But if you've got a turnover of finance staff, key staff, you've had people perhaps long-term sick, and people starting and then leaving. It's not necessarily a sign that things are not well, but quite often when I get appointed and you look back, there has been an issue with high turnover of staff. Sometimes as well, there's been employment tribunal issues, and I don't know if that's again not maybe directly linked, but there has been a correlation in some of the cases that I've been involved in. Another, this was not a red flag, but just something to be mindful of, is asset rich, cash poor. So you might have a charity that has a stonking amount of assets. However, if it doesn't have any cash to pay its creditors, then it can be insolvent. I mean, there are a lot of charities with large physical properties without a property portfolio. Those properties have value, but that value won't pay off your creditors. The point there about asset rich again is that the loss-making trading subsidiary, you might have a substantial debtor in your balance sheet, which makes it look like the charity has lots of assets, but in fact it doesn't. So just be mindful of, just because a company has a good net asset balance doesn't necessarily mean that it will avoid insolvency. Another point I've got here is final red flag is not engaging with key creditors, and specifically landlords. So there is a belief, perhaps among some charities, that people will not submit, people will not wind them up. We cannot pay our landlord, or we can pay our landlord a little bit, or if you've got a lease that has a long lease and you want out of that long lease because it's expensive, you don't need the size of the property that you've got anymore. You think, well, we'll just move out, we'll go to another property, we'll go to a small serviced office and just pay out a monthly rolling at much less amount. If you don't engage with landlords properly, and I suppose that's just making sure that they know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and that they're happy with it. Landlords will wind up, and other creditors will wind up companies. And I think you get to a point in time that if you've lost the trust and the credibility, the relationship's broken down, then it's very difficult to get things back up. And that's where you're a risk. Okay, so that's some red flags, and we went through the financial information that you need. So the next thing is questions that you want to ask when you're in board meetings, and you want to have the reliable financial information to be able to answer these questions. And I think, is my charity facing insolvency? What is insolvency? Insolvency, it's not black and white. It's not, that you can say, yes, it's definitely insolvent. There are matters of degrees, and I've got twilight there, the twilight zone of insolvency. And with this one, there's all these questions. You might actually be able to answer yes to all these questions, but it still avoids insolvency. But I think the more of these questions that you answer yes, then the more likely that the company is facing insolvency, and probably is unlikely to be able to trade out of it. So balance sheet there. Some of the information I've spoken about before just feeds through to that, and just a handy list of questions for you to take to your board meetings. So yes, the more answers to yes, the more likely that you have a problem, and what you do about that problem. So first thing is that there's options. There's always options. But the first thing to do is to take professional advice. When the trustees and directors of a charity know that there's no, and of a company, we'll speak about the different legal entities in a moment, there's no reasonable prospect of avoiding an insolvent liquidation, they must from that time take every step necessary to minimise the impact on the company's creditors. It's a point to note that I did say that most insolvency practitioners, reputable ones, will provide free initial advice, but paying professional fees for advice obtained is justified when you're dealing with how to get the best outcome for the charity's creditors. Early identification of a potential insolvency will mean more options and the more time to implement those options. So some of the things that can be considered: obtaining new funding, emergency funding, just to plug a gap. Who are your stakeholders? Are any of those able to provide some short-term emergency funding? Crowdfunding, you can have a big push on fundraising. The thing about this is you have to be very careful if trustees are considering this course of action, because have you got a loss-making charity, or is it just a gap for a specific reason? Will crowdfunding just give you a pile of cash that will see you through another so many weeks or months of trading? You can look to make amendments with your existing financial commitments. Again, engage with stakeholders for assistance. And there's one, you might get some stakeholders that will give you money, but other stakeholders might give you a bit more time to pay. For example, HMRC, if you have got arrears there, you can enter a time to pay arrangement with them. You look at what are you spending, a review of all your expenses, or what are you providing? Can you cut back? Should you cut back on certain service provision? Realization of surplus assets. So again, it might be if you've got a significant property portfolio and are a cash poor charity, can you sell off some assets without impacting your desired level of service provision? One thing about the realization of surplus assets and property sales can take time. Mergers with other charities or organisations, a solvent winding up. So I'm going to touch on the solvent winding up in a moment, but arranging with creditors is another thing, whether that's all creditors or some creditors. Do nothing, keep your fingers crossed, stick your head in the sand, be an ostrich. If you do nothing, it's likely that a creditor will take action to wind up the charity. HMRC will do it, landlords will do it, other creditors will do it as well. Charity trustees are responsible for the safeguarding of charitable funds, right? So, and those funds are given, and they're to be used for the purpose of the charity and the purpose for which they're given. When future is uncertain and there's no clarity over longer term funding, the option which should be kept under regular consideration is an orderly wind up of the charity. It is a difficult decision to decide to wind up a charity, and the impact on service users will be foremost in the minds of the trustees. However, early consideration of this option means that the surplus remaining funds may be available to be paid over to another charity, and that will fulfil the purposes for which the money was given. There can be orderly communication to the service users and time to find alternative resources for them. And employees also can be given plenty of time to secure alternative employment. Because if you're sort of looking down the barrel of a gun and there is an impending insolvency event, or it's very likely that is the case, if you don't take the decision to wind up earlier, then you might be looking at a catastrophic sudden insolvency wind up, which may be at the instance of a creditor, not the trustees, and that the impact on service users of that is significant, and it can also expose the trustees to personal liability issues. So orderly solvent winding up is something to keep in mind. And one of the things in terms of with that is when you're looking at your reserve policy, that reserve policy, maybe it's like, the minimum is enough to fund an orderly winding up, which might be over a period of 3 to 6 months. Right. So before we go on to speak about the potential implications on the trustees in terms of personal liability issues, we're just going to have a quick look at the different forms of charitable entities that we have in Scotland. So the first one, there's the three probably most common there. You think what type of charity you are or that you're a trustee of. The unincorporated charitable trust is, as well as being, you can have an unincorporated entity or a trust. So it's sort of the two in one. The position's pretty much the same. So the legal position of charity trustees in an insolvent situation varies according to the legal structure of the charity and whether it's a charitable company, like a CLG, a SCIO, or the unincorporated charitable trust. So trustees and directors of a charitable company or a SCIO will not normally have personal liability. You see that the member's liability is limited to a nominal amount, normally £1. And then with the SCIO, again, it's limited liabilities for members, but it's under charities law rather than the company's house. Unincorporated charitable trusts, unincorporated entities and charitable trusts are different. The trustees may have personal liability. The trust itself can't own property or enter contract, so that means that the trustees do. So that there is more of a risk there for the personal liability. So what is the personal liability of a charity's trustee if the charity enters insolvency? So the answer is for SCIOs and companies limited by guarantee, there isn't personal liability except for certain circumstances. And then for the unincorporated trust, that's slightly different. So the instances where trustees and directors of a charitable company or a SCIO might have personal liability is if they've given any personal guarantees, circumstances where they've committed fraud or breached their fiduciary duties, or if they act as a trustee or a director while being disqualified to act as a director. Trading whilst insolvent is the one for companies only, and that trading whilst insolvent is where you know that there's no prospect of the company avoiding insolvency, but you continue to trade and you increase the liabilities of the charity over that period of time. That's gives rise to potential personal liability. Yeah, and so just the trustees of an unincorporated entity, they may have personal liability where the assets of the charity are insufficient to meet its liabilities. Specific creditors might have agreed to no personal liability. It's common in property leases, but ultimately there's a concern for trustees that if the unincorporated entity or the trust does not have enough money to meet the debts of the charity, then the trustees may have to do that out of their own pocket. And whilst there may be agreements between the trustees on how this is shared, the standard position is it's joint and several, which means that any one trustee can be liable for the whole amount. And that means that the creditor may be able to sue an individual. And ultimately, if that individual cannot pay back the amount that the creditor is looking for, then they may have to look at bankruptcy. So that's the position on personal liability. And then the second key question, which I get asked a lot from trustees, are what are the other implications on a trustee personally when a charity enters insolvency? So just because it enters insolvency doesn't necessarily mean, or there shouldn't be any impact on your personal credit rating or your ability to act as a trustee of another charity or as a director of a limited company. When the charity is a charitable company, the conduct of the trustees as directors will be assessed by the insolvency practitioner, and a report will be submitted to the government body, and they can take action to disqualify a director if that director is found to be unfit. And when disqualified, a director can't act as a director of any company. So if you have other directorships, they would have to resign from that position. So some of the things that the insolvency practitioner would report to the government that may lead to the disqualification: poor record keeping, not making VAT returns, not paying any of your, not paying corporation tax returns or PAYE returns, not making payment of any tax due, giving away assets for less than value, taking in payment for services if the trustees know that they will not be able to deliver the services, excessive personal benefits, preferring one creditor over another, particularly connected parties. So that's some of the things that you should just not be doing. Oscar can also take action for misconduct, and the insolvency practitioner, again, they will report any evidence of wrongdoing to Oscar for Oscar to review. Okay, so next we're just going to touch on the winding up process itself. Now this is whether it's an insolvent process, a solvent process, a formal process, or an informal process. There's different procedures for the different types of entities and whether it's insolvent, solvent, formal, informal. But no matter what type of charity is involved, there's similar practical considerations. Stakeholder communication and engagement is really important, in terms of what are you telling your service users, what are you telling your employees, and in terms of you think about a timeline, how long, and key steps in that program. Some things to think about, particularly if you're looking at winding up yourself or doing a solvent winding up, is to look at notice period on contracts, and some of the examples there. So I recently had a charity had entered into a contract with an HR company that were paying a monthly retainer, but they didn't realise they'd actually signed up for a 3-year engagement. So that whole amount was due when the company decided to wind up. Leases with landlords can be similar. There might be quite significant liabilities there because you're tied in for a long period of time. And another one to look out for is photocopier contracts, printer, IT equipment. Again, they can be for long periods, and you might be able to negotiate an early exit, but if not, under the full amount will be due. And employees as well. If you've got a number of employees, for example, if you've got over 20 employees, there are formal sort of employment law procedures to follow. The other thing to think about is, what does your governing document actually say? And you will need to get Oscar consent in any type of winding up, and that's an important consideration in your timing. And it's about really where the surplus funds going to go. What does your governing document say? Can you find another charity that's got the right sort of purposes, and how does that work? There might be other regulatory bodies depending on what your charity actually does, and I think probably that's all I've got to say about the winding up process. So hope you find that useful. Keith, would you like to? You got any questions?
Yeah, thanks very much, Shona, for that. I'm sure everyone will agree you've covered a lot of good practice at the start, even around good financial governance, even before getting into the details around dealing with the signs of financial distress. At the moment, we don't have any questions through. You might just have frightened or scared people into into this. But we'll just wait and see if anybody comes through in the few minutes we've got. I suppose while we're waiting on that, any common mistakes, Shona, that you maybe see from your experience of what trustees maybe make, common mistakes trustees make during financial crises?
I think probably. I mean, the key point of this is about taking advice, but also is not, is asking proper questions, and when something doesn't sound right, or thinking about the explanations that are given. You might have a situation where the trustees aren't involved on a day-to-day basis, but you've got a competent, or appears to be a competent, chief exec there that's running everything. But if you're not seeing, if you're not getting explanations about the variances, if you're not getting detailed lists of the applications that have been applied for and which have been successful, if you're not getting that information, you have to really think why. And if it's, I mean, it might be a resource capacity issue rather than something nefarious going on. But as trustees, you have to get that addressed.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions just coming through. I mean, firstly, we've just got a comment saying thanks very much, and appreciation for the content. So that's nice to have. Thank you, Ewan. From Alexandrina, we're a charitable community benefit society. Would the liabilities be the same as that for a company limited by guarantee?
I'll get back and confirm that to you, but I understand it's similar more to the unincorporated entity position rather than the company.
Yep. Thanks for that. We'll get back on that one. Alan's asking any advice on how trustees set a reserves policy. I don't know if you want to comment, or do you want me to
I think that may be
comment?
better for you to comment on, Keith.
Comment on that one. I think we could cover 45 minutes on this alone, based on a lot of conversations I have on this one, Alan. In short answer, it does depend. I mean, I think the backstop in some senses Sean has touched on is that I see some charities and many charities considering, what might be the reserve they need in that case of wind up. But the kind of factors to consider, as far as I'm concerned, is around the kind of volatility of your income streams. So if you've got very steady income streams that you've got good long-term secure contracts that are in place, then the consideration of how much you might want to hold in reserve to cover monthly expenditure would be different, say, in those circumstances, as to maybe when you rely a lot more on legacy income, which the timing of the receipt of that can be different. It also depends a little bit on the phasing and the type of expenditure that you've got, whether you give out, whether you're tied into employee contracts, etc., or whether you're maybe more a grant making charity, and so therefore can time your cash outflows a bit more and kind of flex your expenditure and your grant making according to what kind of levels of cash you've got. But so it does always, it does really depend, and it's really, I think, for the trustees to sit down and say, over what period of time do you want to secure, might you need to have enough money in place to cover your liabilities while you identify other income sources to come in, or take some steps to reduce future expenditure. As I say, could go into a lot more on that, but it does kind of depend. Got a couple of other questions. Does resigning as a trustee protect you from a possible impending liquidation?
I guess the answer is maybe. in the conduct, just because you're not a trustee at the time of an appointment doesn't mean that your conduct won't be considered, and you might be, you will still be subject to the investigation process and the report. But I think as a matter of record, if you do not agree with the way that the charity is going, and you choose to resign, that's something that'll be taken into account. But just resigning won't get you off any hook.
How much information can a director of a subsidiary expect from the main charity? I think this is probably alluding to, I think that's difficult. I presume this is alluding to the situation where you're just the director of the subsidiary, but you maybe don't see the overarching information. I presume this is very much you've got your own director responsibilities to manage on that subsidiary entity. in that sense, I think it's much going to come down to if you're relying on some support from the parent charity, what's the nature of that in terms of contracts, etc., and from a company perspective, how formal and committed is that obligation? Anything to add, Shona? Or
No.
So, comment from Susan. Charity chair of is doing well financially, so that's great. Yep. Good reserves, etc. But they're embarking on a big expansion, very aware of the financial situation may change. In addition to what you've shared, anything that maybe they should be aware of or considering, being careful not, I think, to be complacent that they've got a strong position. So if you're kind of expanding, any kind of red flags or anything that you've seen around that situation?
I think it's more just about your risk management and, just thinking about, okay, so what are the things that might go wrong with this expansion and how do we mitigate against those risks? So it's just really not going headstrong into a decision that it hasn't really been properly considered and fully discussed, around the trustees.
Okay. Conscious of our time, but we've just got a couple more questions at the moment, so I think we should be able to answer these quite quickly. What's the proper protocol for financial submission to the board members, e.g. monthly or annually, or?
I think it would depend on the circumstances, but it's certainly more than annually.
Annually.
And it's what is the level that's expected. You're even a small charity, you would be expecting to, again, the number of transactions. If you've only got a couple of transactions every month, then that's different from something where there's a lot of transactions. But you'd expect to be looking at bank statements fairly regularly at a very minimum for a smaller charity. So it depends.
It does again depend. I would agree on that one, but yeah. Can an unincorporated body insure the directors against winding up losses?
Yeah, there are. You can get insurance for officers' insurance. I'm not an expert on insurance, but I'm sure that an insurance broker will be able to give you advice on that.
Okay. And then the final question we've got open, the final one we'll take, is just on checking the balance sheets. How can you double check the source of the figures excluding cash flow and P&L?
You get a auditor. Is that not right, Keith?
An independent examiner on an auditor to come in, I suppose, is the best way to get the independent check. But in much of, I'll say, from my listening to this, much of what I've taken away is actually a lot of this ultimately, when it comes down to managing distress, it's cash becomes much more important than the P&L. So ultimately, checking back to those bank statements and understanding, I think the takeaways there, understanding those bank statements, have you got the cash in the bank, and being aware of recoverability of debtors, particularly where it's maybe a trading subsidiary, which is in a wee bit of financial problems itself. And so can you actually convert that into cash itself? So I think we've run through those answers. Hopefully that's given a good response there. Thank you all for your interest and attendance this morning. I have overrun my KPI by a couple of minutes, but I think that's demonstrated by some of those questions coming in. Hopefully, the key takeaway following Shona's guidance will hopefully mean that if there's that knock at your door, that it will never be the Grim Reaper, but hopefully an early friendly advisor to help you manage your way through. We will be planning one further session later this year around financial reporting updates. The precise date and content of that will be announced in due course. We don't have a revised charity SORP at this point, so we'll figure that out once we get there, and we'll let you know. But thank you once again for your attendance, interaction with us, and we'll get these slides out to you later on. Thanks again. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.